Welcome to the Phase Space Invaders podcast, where we explore the future of computational biology and biophysics by interviewing researchers working on exciting transformative ideas. My guest today is Paulo Souza, a group leader in the Laboratory of Biology and Modeling of the Cell at the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon. These days, Paulo works as the main developer of Martini, the arguably most popular coarse-grained force field that unifies lipids, small molecules, proteins, nucleic acids, and many other polymers in an interoperable physics-based framework. In the 2 decades of its evolution, the force field evolved into many directions and flavors, and Paulo co-manages the efforts of the broad community of developers. So we discuss the challenges inherent in managing a project of such a scope and the philosophy behind the systemic way in which Martini is continuously improved and reparameterized. Paulo describes how a user-centric approach helps refine and troubleshoot the model through its wide-scale adoption, and how different limitations of coarse-grained modeling can be addressed to progressively make the force field more predictive and less reliant on user-defined biases. Then we talk about the interplay between force field development and modern trends in biology, biomedicine, and computational sciences. From small molecules to lipid nanoparticles, huge systems such as organelles or viruses, and molecular complexity, understood as going beyond simplified model systems and approaching biologically relevant mixtures and compositions. That's a lot of ground to cover, so let's go. Paulo Souza, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
So, Paulo, I think it's very much unquestionable that Martini has been the most popular coarse-grained force field for biology for a good while. And I have always been cheering for it somewhere in the back of my mind as the most promising candidate to unify the somehow scattered world of coarse-grained modeling. And now you have been in charge of the development of Martini for quite some time too. I gotta say, I know plenty of people who work on, say, improvements of protein or RNA models, but the breadth of the systems that you have to cover for Martini is just not comparable. So I first wanted to ask, how do you even go about the task as general as developing a universal force field for biology that nevertheless incorporates some empirical knowledge from each domain?
Yeah, well, I am a chemist and I always look at the problem from a chemical perspective, right? Although the biomolecules are different and they have a different physical chemical behavior, you also can actually find many things in common. And Martini is about that, right? So Martini is a building block kind of approach, like a Lego, where actually the pieces will make the models. And then you needed to calibrate these pieces in a way that they follow certain chemical trends, but at the same time can be pieces to build all kind of biomolecules. So you needed to have a compromise and test it all at the same time, right? So we have it in the development of Martini. We worked in a way that we started with the pieces, but then the calibration goes on for more complex systems. So actually we can cover more of the chemical space, because even if you only look at the pieces, once you go to chemicals for complex systems, there is still many missing points in the interaction matrix. That's the heart of Martini to cover. So it's natural to, if you want to cover and validate more of the interactions that you need to have in a coarse-grained model as Martini, it's natural to go to all diversity of biological systems. It's the way that actually you can be sure that this Lego kind of approach is working.
Right, so you start with a kind of maximally reductionist approach, and then you look at points where it breaks down or when maybe somehow...
So any coarse-grained model is not transferable, right? You need to be a bit careful. So there are approximations going on, but Martini is very pragmatic. The idea is to try to make it something that is useful. You could see as a toy model that actually you can have a very easy way to get some trends and some ideas, and you can easily change these pieces of Lego and see. But yeah, always be careful. Any coarse-grained model is not transferable, so you need to be considered that if you are going a bit far away from how we validated the model, you should at least test it against some experimental data to see if you actually still valid what you are looking.
Right. So this is where this integrative question comes in, right? So you mentioned that you're able to integrate now a lot of experimental data. What kind of data do you consider for that, for the force field development?
For parameterization of the beats itself, we use a lot of thermodynamic data, right? So Martini, the original model was fully based on partitioning free energy or free energy of transfer. So essentially the tendency of system going from an oil phase to a water phase. But in the newest versions, we have incorporating more. So actually we use a lot of miscibility data as well, because in these we also can play around with the self-interaction that's important aspect in terms of cavity cost. But at the same time, once you have it validate the pieces and you go a bit to more complex systems, you also start to looking other properties. For lipids, it's very common to compare with thickness, area per lipid. For proteins, you can take a look and compare dynamics, protein-protein interactions. And in a later state, even free energies of dimerization. So we go from the pieces of easy thermodynamics to complex systems as well. And this is kind of integrative modeling in this sense, right? So it's a model, in the coarse-grained model development, we call this a top-down approach. So you use experimental data to calibrate the idea, but it's also integrative modeling in the sense that you use experimental data to improve a bit the model. This is from the interaction perspective, okay? No bonded interactions. For bonded interactions, Martini actually relies a lot in atomistic simulations. So in this perspective, is a bottom-up approach.
I can see. What are the most challenging parts that are particular to coarse-grained modeling? I mean, you have all sorts of issues with kinetics and entropic effects and maybe perhaps cooperativity. I imagine you want to address those things in some systematic manner, right?
Well, I think your question has two sides. There is one side that's about developing coarse-grained models, right? And this is about to know the limitations. So once you develop a coarse-grained model, you reduce the degrees of freedom, which means that you need to compensate this somehow with enthalpy, right? And in Martini, this is done, actually, the potential is an effective potential based in Lennard-Jones, which also implies other limitations, right? Lennard-Jones potentials, they have a limit region that is a fluid, which means that actually you have certain limitations of what you really can represent. For instance, solvation free energies, we can get the trends right, but we cannot be quantitative, because if you try that with Lennard-Jones, you go to the solid phase. So in this sense, actually, I missed one part of your question. Can you repeat again?
Cooperativity, for example, like multiple hydrogen bonds.
Yes, so these also for directionality, for instance, you cannot represent, but you can somehow represent the difference in strength of the interactions with that, or the propensity of being a bit stronger interactions in relation to a system that doesn't form hydrogen bonds, right? So these things, you can incorporate it in an effective way, but as a developer, you needed to be aware and see how you compensated that. And this is all in this effective potential that you have it. This is from a developer perspective, right? For a user, there are also other aspects. One aspect that you need to be careful is actually numerical instability. When you build models with coarse graining, you have a specific time step that you use for the integration of the motion equations, and actually getting models stable is one challenge that they have at that. So there are other limitations when you look at it from a user perspective, how you build it and how you can interpret what you're doing. Actually, there is one point that users tends to do very badly, is actually going to directions that the coarse-grained model was not designed. So for instance, if you look at in our papers, we never look at solid state. But so if you try to use that with coarse-grained model as Martini, the tendency is that will not work, right? So be aware of the limitations from a user perspective, so you can properly use the model, and creating models is stable, while for the development, you needed to somehow incorporate what is missing in a different way, and be aware, right? So there is no free lunch. Every time that you actually simplify the system, you are losing something.
And on top of that, you have the question of model flexibility versus portability, right? So you're, for example, developing the model with, I imagine, GROMACS in mind primarily. Does that limit you in terms of how expressive the physics can be? You know, if you have to constrain yourself to functions that are expressible in this one particular engine?
Yes, indeed. But this is in part of the philosophy of the Martini developers. So one key aspect we want, if you are working with coarse-grained, then you want a model that is fast, right? So needs to pay off because you're not doing atomistic. And then we want to take advantage of these decades of development of MD codes as GROMACS, OpenMN now, but also NAND. We know that they also already implemented Martini before. And with that, we can keep competitive, right? So this is, in the end, is a choice. We needed the model to be fast, and we want to take advantage of what is already around and being developed. Not only in terms of speed up, but in terms of techniques, right? GROMACS together with Plumed, you can use all the free energy methods that are there. So this is one aspect of the model. Another aspect that is important, we like it to keep the model easy to use. And this is not for citations necessarily, is really with the idea that a model needs to be testable. If you are developing methods and approaches that actually others in the modeling community cannot use it and cannot test it, you are not sure actually what you're saying, right? You needed this external validation from the community. And the idea of keeping easy is fundamental, and keeping like using GROMACS is also connected with that, right? We want in a way that people can easily start it. Like one day looking our tutorials, you already can start your first simulations.
I imagine that if you have such a big task of developing a general force field, you're going to rely at some point on the feedback from the community, right? That people will tell you, oh, look, this kind of systems do not work, or this kind of systems have some issues that are introduced by the latest version. Because now Martini 3, from what I understand, is trying to address the shortcomings of Martini 2, which was stickiness, right?
For biomolecules, this was one of the main issues, right? So people, especially looking protein-protein interactions, they have many problems because they tended to interact in a non-productive way, right? Whatever interface you look at, actually, they would interact too strongly. So we put a lot of effort on that. But even so, and actually we're, I think, near to 7 research groups. The paper was 26 authors, but actually was even more like people testing. And even doing all these efforts, we still actually couldn't cover all the bases. So once we published, you saw actually start to see people already trying to test in Martini in the protein model in different contexts, and then they're already starting problems, right? So it is extremely important that the community tested the model, and this is the way that actually we learn it. In parts that actually we miss it during the calibration or validation, and now we can actually work in improvements. That's already the current state, right? When we released the Martini 3, the protein model, you could say that was even a prototype in this sense, because they was not super fully tested. And now after this phase of testing, we are now actually pushing to a new phase where many of these problems that were reported in the literature will be solved as well. And this is an infinite cycle, right? This is the beauty of the thing. And this has happened because the model is popular. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this feedback, or would take it longer to actually find out the problems.
I see. But what I perceive as the biggest complexity of building coarse-grained systems is you need to know what kind of information you have to put into the model and what kind of information you can get out, right? Especially in the case of, say, proteins. How much you can rely on, let's say, conformational sampling of internal protein motions, how much you can predict new protein-protein interfaces.
Indeed. For instance, in a first level, actually, if you are trying to benchmark protein-protein interactions with Martini, certainly you need to test the ones that actually don't change it too much, the conformation, right? Mm-hmm. This is the first step. So you take the tests that actually don't see conformational changes. Once this is actually reasonably working, then you go step by step for things that starts changing, to a point that there are now people looking also IDPs, right? So we have a prototype models now that even they are unfolded in certain environment, and once they bind, they go to another environment. This is like they'll go to other secondary structure. So this is like the holy grail of the whole thing, something that could change fully the conformation. But this is the last step, and super hard to get it, possibly impossible for certain cases, right? So if you look at, for instance, a protein that has structural waters inside, let's say that there is a water making a bridge between 2 residues, how actually you can deal with that in a coarse-grained model? So you represented one water as a coarse-grained bit. So there are many challenges ahead, right? But for some cases, actually, it's doable, and we are moving ahead towards that.
Right. So you would say there is a pathway to maybe at some point get rid of the elastic network model, or to free the protein to behave in a kind of self-directed way.
We recently released a new preprint about this Go Martini 3, and also a mini review about the protein model. And in both, we try to make some statements. So one aspect that we have now in the model is this really separation of the protein model and what we call the bias. And the bias is the elastic or the goal. So now these models needs to be completely separated. And the bias comes to fix problems, but the model needs to be in a way that every time that now improve the protein model, the bias needs to sense that in a way that you need to reduce. So, and this now is giving us a direction for that. And we have models nowadays that, for instance, we are able to change secondary structure already. So this is already like something that it was not possible before. So, and which means that I can get rid of many of the elastic networks or goal potentials there. Also, once we actually improved a bit the protein-protein interactions concerning the backbone, for instance, let's say that I rescue a bit of the directionality, then maybe now I can represent better the data sheets. And these also remove it a bit. So one day we will fully remove it, elastic and goal models. This is the, let's say, the direction, is the topic goal that everyone in the field should have it. Right now we are going towards that, and let's see how far we can go. I think not with Martini 3. Maybe with a new version in the future, maybe it will be possible. But with this current set of beats and the way that we work it, you still have some limitations as the structural waters that I just mentioned to you.
I see. And how much can you benefit from the recent development in, let's say, AI structural prediction? Does it change the way you work with the force field, or is it something completely orthogonal?
I would say that this is still something that we are digesting, right? So one aspect that we are definitely incorporating soon is for automatic parameterization of new models, right? And for that, actually, we needed to increase our data base of molecules. And once you reach a certain number, we know that some deep learning approach will possibly solve the problem. So, but not for all classes of molecules, right? We expected for small molecules would be the case, but for other ones, we don't think that will be still possible. We will not get, for instance, full validate, let's say, accurate polymer model with this approach, we think, because this is the way that the Martini works. So this is one aspect. Other aspect that we have been looking is actually how we improved our bounded potentials with machine learning as well, because this is something that we can do it. Right now, we are limited with the potentials that we fitted against some atomistic simulations, but we could potentially start predicting potentials that actually could have a balance of secondary structure. And then these would allow us to actually give it transitions. This is also another point that is impacting. In the future, like say Martini 4, this is the way that I see it. Possibly the whole interaction matrix of Martini will be based or partially based in some AI approach. We still don't know how, right? Because if you go so Martini is based in this interaction matrix. This means that the interactions doesn't follow a Lorentz-Berthelot rules, right? You don't use combination rules. This means that you need to define each pair of interaction of all the 843 bits that we have there. And how much of these pair interactions are validated, which means that you have experimental data, is 20% maybe. The rest relies in a lot of chemical intuition or chemical knowledge that you have about trends of how molecules work. How you incorporated these in a machine learning kind of approach is to don't know. And because many points there we will not be able to find out. Only in complex systems, not in the simple systems that we use to calibrate the bit-bit interactions.
I can see how AI systems can be really good at interpolating, but not necessarily at extrapolating to those unexplored regimes. So yeah, a very important consideration there. And as you say, you set up a database of models, right? Where you can collect user input now on well-parameterized, well-validated small molecules.
Yeah, this is not my idea, right? So actually it's a work of one colleague of mine, Guillaume Launay, and this is possibly expanded in the future. The idea was actually to have this database, so not only the developers, but anyone that has a model that was validated and published would put it there. And even if it's published, every time that someone submits a model, this model passes by a curation. So we have it like the Martini developers taking a look if it's actually well, and then placing there. And the idea is continually is growing this database until the point that actually would be very useful for everyone for exactly the automatic topology builders. Not there yet. So right now, I think we have it near to 500 molecules there. But in terms of chemical space, not too much is covered. Because most of these molecules, for instance, actually half, I would say, that are lipids. But we have an ongoing effort to expand it now for more like ionic liquids, deep tech solvents that you already published and we're still developing. We're also working with new classes of lipids. And for that, we are using fragments like lipids in lipid nanoparticles. We have been working. So we are pushing new applications, but also keeping in mind about this new chemical space that we are covering so we can fit in the database as well.
I can imagine that much of the development is actually driven by trends, right? What becomes important for the community. If there is a new thing like, I don't know, vaccines, then maybe nanolipid formulations will become a burning issue.
Well, definitely. The delivery systems was always a nice application of coarse-grained models, right? Given their size. So they usually are, you could look at from nano to microemulsions to lipid nanoparticles, and then they have a sizes that go from 50 to 100 nanometers. There is even micrometer size. And this is like a coarse-grained realm, right? So this is where actually coarse-grained really shine in relation to atomistic models. And with the vaccines and this whole development of new generation of lipids, this is really giving a lot of new developments in Martini to support the area. So we can maybe one day even do screening of this. So in one side, you have the screening, but on the other side, you also get the benefit of creating new models, increasing this database that we one day will help us not only lipid nanoparticles, but all the other emerging fields that we have, small molecule binding to proteins, also people working in interface of biology materials, also have colleagues working in materials itself, polymers, semiconductors, green solvents, yes. Will be.
So it all contributes to the same goal in the end. How do you say the ultimate goal? We had this conversation with Dan Zuckerman recently here on the podcast, where we were discussing the pros and cons of going really, really big in terms of organelle and cells versus really, really profoundly studying the small systems to make sure that we understand what is happening on the small scale. And so where does Martini development go in this regard? I can imagine both, but what is the philosophy behind it?
I think Martini actually contributed a lot to the view of going to complex systems, right? So actually, we've been using this kind of thing in our talks, right? So if you look at, for instance, the lipid field, right? If you go to 90s, the 80s, let's go to the 80s, people were simulating one component lipid bilers, picoseconds, right? Then if you move it 20 years in time, you start to see these multi-component membranes, like 2-3 different lipids, also some proteins there. But then here now is not more atomistic. You see coarse-graining. And now we move it again 20 years. We are in what we call the computational microscopy area, right? That actually you can model things in their full complexity. And what's the gain in that? For me, although every time that you increase in size, of course, you cannot go so long in time, right? So you cannot run longer simulations, but at the same time, you can have many copies of your protein of interest in a more complex, realistic environment. And this is something that actually for people that want to understand biology is super valid, right? Because sometimes for transmembrane proteins, for instance, for years, people only study them in POPC membranes, which actually can be very far away from the real lipid environment that they are in cells, which are actually asymmetric membranes with hundreds of types of lipids, which actually can play a huge role in the modulation of their function. So I really see these as a very important thing. Although this needs to go hands to hand also with the simple systems, because in the simple systems is the ones that we can validate the model. Okay, so while in the complex we go to the frontiers of what we can predict, in the simple ones is the ones that we use it to really check it how good are. So both are important in this sense. But I think we need to keep it both, because one is more realistic for biological applications. The other, we can be sure about how accurate it is the model.
It's kind of fascinating that the world of science is slowly inching towards complexity science, right? People are trying to define complexity, to study complex systems. So it's really cool to see that we as molecular scientists will be able to take part in this new exploration.
Indeed, and we are only touching, right? It is only starting, right? We are talking about complexity, but in the future, if you have this complexity, you also need to think in non-equilibrium, and you also have fluxes, differences in protonation state, how these all will be incorporated in the system, so you really can start simulating, who knows, maybe a whole cell or a fusion of a cell with a huge nanoparticle, things like that. So it's very exciting. I know that many people are fully interested in what AI can actually bring it, but this other side of modeling is also a huge thing, and soon we will explode, I think.
No, absolutely. I see there's a lot of attempts at just throwing data at AI, but I think without a very serious kind of inductive bias from the physical side, we can easily get lost in what the AI predictions turn out to be. That's a consistent motif coming out from that research.
Indeed.
And then, well, complexity has the particular feature of being complex, so we shouldn't expect simple answers, I guess. Okay, then thank you a lot, Paulo Souza. Thanks for the conversation. Thanks for sharing your knowledge.
You're welcome. I would like to thank you for the invitation, and please continue this fantastic work. It's really promising. I'm really liking this podcast.
Thanks a lot. Great conversation. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode of Space Invaders.